Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Bill Kristol, Elliot Abrams, Douglas Feith, Charles Homer. I mean, like, that's just such a crazy list. I mean, It's like the virus originated here. This is where it all came from. Everything that we've experienced since 9/11, like, it all was incubated under Scoop Jackson's Senate term.
In the annals of time, riding social forces as they crest and crash onto the shores of history, some would-be heroes stumble but manage to recover their breath. Others are reduced to the flotsam and jetsam of nostalgia. These others are our subjects. They are the vanquished.
Welcome to The Vanquished. Anders J. Lee here with Freddie G.
So happy to be here.
And we are joined by the one and only Sean P. McCarthy.
Even more happy to be here.
Talking today about someone who you share a home state with, Washington State. Not a good person per se, but I thought he would be interesting to have you on to talk about because you're from Washington State, and also this guy was a hardcore neocon, and you're not a fan of neocons, us either. Scoop Jackson is his name, Henry Scoop Jackson. Is he big in the state of Washington? Is he all over the place?
Well, I graduated from the University of Washington in Seattle, and so I would always see his bust there because they have the Scoop Jackson School of International Affairs. But I only just learned that his bust, it was unveiled in the 80s after he died in 83, but they had to hide it in an abandoned corridor because all the students at the University of Washington hated Scoop Jackson because he was a neocon. So they tucked it in the end of an abandoned hallway. But then in 2006, and now, my generation, we had no idea who the fuck Scoop Jackson was.
Yeah.
You can bring the bust back out, and now it's in a prominent place on the UW campus, and most people who've been there have seen the bust at some point. So that was all that I knew of him.
I'm trying to think what the first exposure I had to him. I mean, I've heard about him recently, just Israel, he comes up sometimes, other foreign policy. But like a lot of people, I hear Scoop Jackson and I think of the sports journalist who was named Scoop Jackson. I think there's maybe another Scoop Jackson, or there's
There's a Stu Jackson who coached the Vancouver Grizzlies that only I remember. So we're not going to go big on him, but Scoop Jackson, NBA reporter. As far as I know, does not favorite interventionist foreign policy to win the Cold War.
Right. I was going to say, do people yell at the sports reporter fuck Israeli apartheid?
Yeah, I wonder how he feels about that. Interestingly, the sports reporter is named Scoop because after he was born the day after JFK was assassinated. And his uncle was
they scooped JFK's brains out.
That could it could be interpreted
That's better
that way.
Than what it is, honestly, yeah.
Yeah, it is because his uncle said, "Well, that boy scooped Kennedy," which at first I thought that meant maybe he's accusing a baby of assassinating JFK, but no, it just means that he got out in front. He was a bigger deal to the Jackson family than the president being killed. But his name came about, he got the nickname because he looks like a cartoon character from a strip that they would read in the early 20th century. This is the character. It's just like a bald guy with a hat bending over.
Yeah, being told you look like this cartoon character in 1910s was the equivalent of an autism diagnosis.
Yeah, they were calling him a huge dork. I mean, the cartoon character does look like a baby, so I could see that in the sense that he's bald. Fred, you had a thought that perhaps Scoop Jackson is what FDR would have been if he lived to fill out his last term.
Yeah, so Scoop likes the New Deal. He's a neocon on foreign policy. He's liberal, like FDR on the New Deal kind of stuff, helping people out. And then if FDR had lived, I think he would have gotten wrapped up into the Cold War. And then he would have been Scoop Jackson. So Scoop Jackson is the son that FDR never had.
Interesting. Yeah, I like to think Roosevelt would have been more woke than that, but possibly not.
I mean, it's arguable, Roosevelt had the good neighbor policy towards South America. He was a little less interventionist than had kind of been the norm beforehand. And I guess that's what they say is that they put Truman in there because he was more hawkish. But yeah, I mean, FDR would have been under incredible pressure because there was just so much money in it. And that's, what I find fascinating about Scoop Jackson is, called the senator from Boeing or whatever, where it's like, I'm sure he believed all this stuff about freedom and democracy. It just happened to perfectly align with the interests of Washington state business.
Exactly.
And so, it's like kind of a chicken and egg. Like, are they doing this for the money? Do they really believe it? It seems like both.
No, that's usually an easy explanation, a good explanation for people's intentions in politics at this level. There's a quote on how he viewed the Soviet Union, claims that the Soviets have not changed. They still fear the exposure of their people to Western society, and that remains a cornerstone of their totalitarian approach. They're like a burglar going down a hotel corridor, trying all the doors. When they find the one that's unlocked, they go in. So just this kind of very paranoid view of the world that the Soviets are lurking around every corner when really they were kind of in retreat for most of the Cold War.
Yeah, that is how neocons are. Anyone who disagrees with your foreign policy is a criminal.
Yeah. Why would the Soviets fear exposure to Western culture? Then 3 million Russians die in the 1990s when we bring them Western culture, privatize everything.
Well, when he got into politics, he saw it as politics ended at the water's edge. So he did come of age at a time where America was a lot more isolationist. So to him, there's a logic to being progressive on domestic issues and imperialist in your outlook on foreign policy, because that was kind of, to him, the same as internationalism.
Yeah, and just he didn't think like, he's like, well, we're at war with Vietnam. Why would anyone question our war policy? That's over the water's edge. You can't debate that. He never really got what people would.
But yeah, as we said, he was born in 1912, son of Norwegian immigrants, of which there are a lot in Washington State. I didn't learn that until I was an adult. I thought it was like just the Dakotas in Minnesota, but you got a lot of Nords up there.
Are you ashamed of him as a fellow son of Norway?
I am a little bit, and there are a lot of things we have in common, which is very weird. He thankfully did not get a Scandinavian name. I think, they probably would have given him a nickname too if he had been named like Sven or Anders or something. But his real name was Henry. Probably his parents were like, we want this kid to be normal, and we're not going to give him a weird name from the 1800s like mine did. But he went to U of W, your alma mater, for undergrad, went there for law school, and then he comes back to Snohomish County, where he wins a reputation as a foe of, this is what the New York Times says, prostitutes, slot machine operators, and bootleggers. Kind of a small-town lawyer, gets elected in 1940 to Congress, and he himself is an isolationist at first. He votes against the initial plans to help the UK through the Lend-Lease program. And then things develop in Europe, and he changes his mind. And for the end of his career, he's like, the U.S. must be engaged in the world. He also was a very enthusiastic supporter during World War II of Japanese internment.
Right. He actually tried to prevent them from going home.
Yeah.
But that was mostly a West Coast initiative. It was like in California and Seattle and stuff along the West Coast. It was mostly just white people wanted to steal businesses from Japanese people.
Interesting. Did they get the businesses back?
It's okay. Like eventually there was compensation.
Yeah, it's a pretty racist quote, but it's like the disciples of Bushido, by insidious and indirect means themselves, and a great many organizations in the same fashion the Nazis have utilized their organization. Basically, he thinks like there's like a business network, and there's all these. Every Japanese person is involved in this thing, that like conspiracy against the U.S. And it's real racist and bad.
There's a documentary that on YouTube that's like It's called One of Ours. It's put out by the Scoop Jackson Society or whatever.
Ooh.
And one of like his classmates from the 1920s in high school remembers him like being freaked out about the possibility of a Japanese invasion when he was in high school. And the classmate said, like, yeah, I joked with him, like, don't worry, the longshoremen would never let him through or something like that. And he didn't speak to me for weeks. He was just so serious about the yellow peril.
Yeah.
Yeah, another point is like, there's direct orders coming from the son of heaven in Tokyo.
Also, some views that didn't hold up well on Zionism. He visits a concentration camp at the end of the war and is kind of radicalized by that into the belief in a Jewish state. But at the same time, traveling around the world also leads him to support universal health care after he goes to Norway in 1945.
I do want to say something on Zionism, though, because I was thinking about this on the way here. Like, he's considered the father of neoconservatism, and of course, Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Perle and these people like were his aides in the Senate. They're like the neoconservatives. But like Zionism and neoconservatism can't really be untangled. Like it's not like two separate things, Because I think like people have this idea of neoconservatism that it kind of like that was the George W. Bush administration, and
Right.
now we've moved beyond that. And I think like when we talk, everything that's going on in Gaza, like this is the culmination of the Scoop Jackson project. Like he won, or his ideas won, anyways. It's just like the assumptions and the beliefs of Scoop Jackson are so internalized in the entire U.S. foreign policy structure now that you have the genocide in Gaza. It's just treated like not a big deal. This is the worst crime that the U.S. empire has engaged in since the Vietnam War. I mean, this is horrific what's going on. And it's, and I think like if you go through his career, his Zionism and his neoconservatism are like so bound up together. And there's no easy like separation of the two.
Yeah, neoconservatism is basically treating the enemies of America the way Israel treats the Palestinians.
Sure. Absolutely, and it's the similar rhetoric that's always used towards Saddam Hussein. They're saying a lot of the same things about the people of Gaza, who, as little leverage as Saddam Hussein did, they have like way less. So yeah, very pervasive ideology that he helped kickstart. He gets elected to the Senate 1952, defeats a Republican incumbent, and becomes the junior senator. Washington has a senior senator named Warren Magnuson, and they get a really silly nickname as a duo. They're called Maggie and Scoop. And they served together for 3 decades. Magnuson is controlling the Appropriations Committee, and Scoop, meanwhile, is becoming a minor expert in military affairs and hardware.
So I did want to go back to the healthcare thing. He's in Europe after World War II, and Norway gives him universal healthcare for some disorder that he has. And after that, he believed in universal healthcare. So he was neocon who believed in universal healthcare. And they really don't make those anymore.
One other thing, the documentary, the One of Ours documentary, they say that after he graduated from UW Law in 1935, before he became the attorney of Snohomish County, he was working for the Federal Emergency Relief Agency. So like 35, 36, the welfare arm of the New Deal. And apparently he had like a lot of exposure to, people in poverty in Everett who would like only eat peanuts, or they would like not be able to change their underwear. I mean, this is the Great Depression. There was like a lot of poverty. His work in the welfare office did make him a supporter of welfare policies, the social democrat, social fascist kind of.
Yeah, all his positions are based on something that happened to him personally.
Right.
And I guess he never personally met an Arab person or a Vietnam person. He goes to the Soviet Union at some point, but I think he makes sure that nothing sticks where he doesn't become a commie.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's also part of like a cohesive view of like this is how social justice is furthered, is with welfare, but also with bombs, and we need to do both. He is very critical of Eisenhower for not spending enough money on the military, calls for investment in nuclear submarines, and he is a hard anti-communist his entire career. But he is at least critical of Senator McCarthy. The reason being, he thinks this gives anti-communism a bad name.
Right.
And he was right. It really did.
Yeah, without McCarthy, right? Maybe, I don't know, that it would have that did kind of help show what was lurking in the background for like this is how crazy anti-communism is. But liberals largely felt the same way.
Chill on my uncle though.
Right. Another Irish. It was. I guess he would have been Irish. Joe McCarthy too.
That sounds right. I think he drinks himself to death.
That's right.
Yeah, that sounds about right. He just doesn't look Irish though. He's got like the unibrow, kind of a olive skin, or at least
He was a secret Irish. That's why he needed McCarthyism for Irish people.
yeah, yeah. He was compensating for being fake, but he is considered in 1960 to be JFK's running mate. Kennedy passes him over, but at the time, Kennedy's a Catholic, so he really has to make up for that, speaking of compensation. So he picks LBJ as his running mate, for other reasons too, but he makes sure to select a Protestant head of the DNC, and Scoop Jackson gets that gig because he's a good Norwegian, I assume Lutheran boy, and is not aligned with the Pope. Apparently, Fred, you found out RFK wanted Jackson on the
RFK
ticket.
said it. Yeah, he would be great. RFK definitely didn't want. RFK didn't like LBJ. I don't know if that he was too enthusiastic about Humphrey. But basically, the dad Joe is like, "Oh, we need to win, and LBJ is going to help us in Texas." And that help was pretty shady. We talked about it in another episode. So they pick LBJ for that reason.
The Seymour Hersh Dark Side of Camelot book, which I have some issues with, but their story is basically like RFK was completely against LBJ as the vice president, but then like at the convention, Kennedy was approached with like some sort of blackmail and basically made to take him on the ticket. Kennedy was having all sorts of affairs and things, but I don't know how true that story is, but that's one explanation.
Well, you know who wasn't having affairs? Scoop Jackson, because he was not having a lot of sex, even as a politician in the 50s. He was a bachelor, and this is, unfortunately, one of the things I said that I do relate to very much as a Norwegian is there's this where he is dating an actress, Martha Wright from Duvall, Washington, who's a comedy musical actress around Seattle, and she moves to New York, and she and Scoop keep up a correspondence. And he goes to New York to take her out. She was not strict about sex, and they go back to her apartment. She thinks he's interested, and then he's like, well, I got to go watch the 11 o'clock news. So have a good night.
He wanted his scoops. And call him Scoop as he's always trying to pick up his fumbles.
Yeah.
He is like the Scandinavian version of an evil person. He's just like very austere, like doesn't really drink much or have much interest in like sex or power, and doesn't really like lie that much. Just on his core, there's like evil assumptions, but you can tell that's what he really believes, and he's trying his best.
He's in it for the love of the game, of being evil, essentially. He is named the Senate's most eligible bachelor by Time magazine, which probably isn't saying too much. They call Washington Hollywood for ugly people, so low bar. But
yeah, we didn't get to look at the other pictures of the senators. Later, the Senate gets hot when RFK joins, but he's not an eligible bachelor, but he's still fucking more than Scoop.
JFK may have gotten on that list, even though he technically wasn't a bachelor at that point. But he does get married in the early 60s. And when he's already a senator, his wife Helen is a Senate staffer from New Mexico. Their first date is tea in the Senate cafeteria.
The book about this does say, the Kaufman book says that she was swept off her feet. So, yeah, I think she was turned on by senators, and he was turned on by Senate staffers.
Yeah, it seemed like he did date some of his staff here and there, right?
Yeah, supposedly the women in his staff didn't get a lot of power, and he would take them out. Now, taking them out could mean just going out in the town and not fooling around. So I'm not sure how far it went.
I wouldn't put it past Scoop to do that. Just like probably made a lot of women Senate staffers uncomfortable because they were just confused at the mixed signals he was giving off. But
yeah, they were like, he made me listen to foreign policy for 3 hours and didn't even try to sleep with me. What's going on?
But he is an early advocate of U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia. Eventually, he's a little like wishy-washy on Vietnam, but even by 1975, he's maintaining this was the right call. We had to do it. And he thinks not wanting to fight in Vietnam at the beginning is appeasement, and is a strong believer in domino theory. If this one country goes communist, then the rest of the region will, which is obviously an oversimplification. Now China and Vietnam both have communist governments, and they're at odds with each other on various things. But later on, he does become pro-China, but he doesn't want to stop fighting Vietnam. The justification a lot of the biographers give him is just he's a stubborn guy. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, there's no domino theory if we're not against China.
Right.
But yeah, and by then, he's very much into Nixon building the relationship up with China.
It's like by 1965, or the stat that I got was in 1965, 80% of Boeing's business was military contracts. And so, I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and there's no way of disentangling it. A lot of the prosperity there was just, Boeing. It was called Jet City. So, and of course the Vietnam War was such a bonanza for Bell Helicopter and all these people that I could just see, again, it's hard to kind of disentangle the money from the real belief where maybe he in some level accepted that Vietnam was lost, but it was just so much, such a gravy train that it would be hard for him to cut it off, I guess.
Yeah.
See, Jet City sounds like where the Jetsons live. Like, it's amazing paradise. No, it's just building planes to kill people in Asia.
Do they say what the Jetsons do? What George Jetson does? It feels like he is a military contractor or something.
Those sprockets, he's making basically sprockets. They probably are part of the military-industrial complex.
He's making Agent Orange to defoliate.
Some planet out there, yeah. Well, yeah, as you mentioned, Senator from Boeing, he gets that nickname for not just his support of Boeing getting contracts and federal subsidies, but he gives a Boeing lobbyist his Senate office or space in his office to use so he can get a subsidy for a supersonic transport plane. So very much a believer in military Keynesianism, and that this is going to help the people of Washington and also, American empire. By the 1960s, France is becoming a little less supportive of Israel. Scoop pushes for America to become the country that arms them, and even clashes with Senator Fulbright on this.
Fulbright is not for it. So France, during the Suez Canal war times, Israel was supported by France. France may have actually been the ones who helped them develop the nuclear bomb. And then de Gaulle's like, no more of this. And Scoop is like, okay, we'll defend Israel. We'll give Israel become the arsenal of Israel, and we still are to this day. And Fulbright's against it, and eventually the Israel lobby is able to get Fulbright out of his job, and that might be one of the first people they defeat. That's early 70s.
He is kind of aligned with Nixon on foreign policy. He even is offered the job of Secretary of State in 1969, but he turns it down so he can run against Nixon in 72, which Nixon saw coming, which is the reason he gave him the offer, is to neutralize him as a challenger, because he saw Scoop Jackson as a formidable opponent, rightly or wrongly, and also Kissinger wants to run foreign policy essentially unilaterally and kind of push the rest of the cabinet aside. So maybe he and Jackson would have butted heads here and there.
Yeah, Nixon in the post-World War II era, I think it's the least powerful Secretary of Defense. This is just him and Kissinger running things.
Right. Yeah. And Jackson also says, if I join a Republican president, that's going to kind of de facto make me a Republican. And I feel a strong moral obligation to fight for the soul of my party and not leave it. That language, fight for the soul, is reminiscent of Joe Biden, who's getting elected not long after this, and Scoop Jackson's a huge influence on his life.
Jackson definitely, he believed in the social welfare New Deal stuff, whereas I feel like today's Democrats, that's like window dressing. Like he was a committed warmonger, but he also believed truly in the New Deal stuff. And the modern Democratic Party, they're still committed warmongers, but they're more we'll just talk about, Biden will be the next FDR to get the fucking idiots to pull the lever.
Yeah.
They don't believe any of this shit.
Right. And the Republicans, after the GOP, they start becoming more hawkish. Before that, they aren't necessarily. Nixon is elected on a peace platform in 1968 that he's not very, transparent about what that actually entails. And turns out he has no interest in actually pursuing peace. But the Democrats are generally more dovish, and Scoop in the early 70s is starting to work with the Republicans on stuff like ballistic missiles. His 1970 Senate campaign gets a lot of money from Republican donors. Despite that, he is helping create the EPA, doing things like that. Big supporter of land preservation, and establishes a lot of national parks and stuff like that. That's kind of his profile going into 1972. In 1970, he's an early favorite for the Democratic nomination. Starts testing the waters early on in 1971. Goes to 36 states and says we can't buy any of this new left mumbo jumbo, and we need a hard confrontation with the Soviets, basically alluding to maybe a hot war somewhere. And he announces on November 20th, 1971, in a Senate office building caucus room, which, not the most exciting place to launch your campaign, most people would go to their home state. And if you have a state like Washington, you can find a beautiful view for the cameras to capture. But instead, he's like, we're going to do it in the Senate office building.
The idea of portraying yourself as an outsider is not something he would know to do.
Yeah.
Jimmy Carter may have kind of invented that too.
Right.
76.
He was really not a shrewd thinker in terms of PR and image, but he has a speech in this announcement where this is kind of a crazy speech. He goes after Muskie, he says
Said he was crying like a bitch.
Yeah. People who don't know, Muskie was the front runner for a while, senator from Maine. It looks like he's crying in a video, and that helps doom his campaign. But Muskie apparently has said something about the Attica riots, the prison riots in Attica, New York, and said that, there's something going on in America, and it's bad. He's not very specific, but he's like, we got a problem. There's some kind of social unrest here, and I want to solve it. And Scoop is adamant that there is nothing wrong with America, actually. He says this society is not a guilty, imperialistic, and oppressive society. This is not a sick society. This is a great country, which is an odd message when you're running to change the country ostensibly. Like, why should people vote for you if you think everything's so great?
1970, which is right afterwards, a height of like political violence.
Yeah.
That's when Kent State is a million, the weather, underground, all that stuff. It's a really fucked up time to say that things aren't fucked up as a challenger. Go ahead, Sean.
Oh, just both your Kennedy friends just got killed. MLK, Malcolm. I mean, in the '60s, Walter Reuther. I mean, everybody, basically every progressive just happened to die from lone gunmen in the '60s, or plane crashes in the case of Walter Reuther.
Right, but yeah, he's saying everything's peachy keen, and he's running with a campaign logo that is just a red and blue stripe above and below Jackson 72. I think this is a fatal error. He did not lead with his name, with Scoop, because usually when you're known by a first name or a nickname, that's what you put on the poster. But instead he did Jackson. There's a lot of other Jacksons who aren't politicians in 1972, probably confused people.
It's a huge four. We've got Andrew Jackson, Stonewall Jackson. Yeah. It's too. Yeah, I mean, even Jesse Jackson's becoming more famous. Yeah, this looks like kind of like a food logo, like a really crappy food brand, like maybe the generic like Culver's or something.
When Jesse Jackson ran for president, he used the same banner, but he had to say Jackson, not the one who wants to go back to war in Vietnam.
And he was Jesse, people knew him as Jesse. But Scoop is against a reduced troop presence in Europe, even though at this point, like I know in the early 60s, Kennedy was kind of worried about like Berlin and so, but like by the 70s, they're not invading anybody in Europe. Like, there's some issue in Poland, but other than that, like the Cold War is not a contest at this point. But he does say we shouldn't get bogged down in more Vietnams, but he claims to neither be a hawk nor a dove. He just doesn't want America to be a pigeon. He wants us to be a wise owl.
These neoconservatives, they all became convinced that the CIA was lying about the strength of the Soviet Union. Because the CIA, they have professional analysts, and they would release a report every year on the state of the Soviet military, and they were very accurate, which is like the Soviet military, it was functional, but it was not a threat to the United States in the 70s. And all these people who wanted more defense spending were like, the CIA is lying. They're protecting the Soviet Union. And so eventually this would become, when George H.W. Bush becomes director, they do the Team B analysis, which they bring in these outside analysts, including Paul Wolfowitz, and they say, actually, yeah, the CIA was wrong. The Soviet Union's so fucking powerful now. We need a massive boost in defense spending. And Jackson was like kind of instrumental in that. Like it was some of his aides kind of set it up. And also like I watched like some town hall he gave in Missouri in 1975.
Oh, yeah, with Lytton.
Even there he was talking about like the Soviet buildup. Like I assume he was convinced that the CIA was lying and that he really truly believed that the Soviet Union militarily was extremely powerful and was spending so much more and was like so much more advanced than the U.S. at the time.
It's really too bad they didn't learn, but yeah, there was the Missile Gap campaign in
Right.
1960, and that didn't turn out to be true.
Right.
Which Kennedy was proposing, and Scoop was Kennedy was one of his heroes, so he was kind of sticking with that. Like, we have to outflank the Republicans on missiles and weapons and the Soviet Union.
If Scoop, he was like, I'm not a hawk or a devil. If Scoop's not a hawk, who is?
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of like when guys say, like, I'm not liberal or conservative, and, like, they're definitely conservative.
On domestic policy, though, he is still to the left of Nixon, very for public works spending, in favor of price controls, wage controls. He thinks Nixon's new economic policy has been a failure, and thinks we have to move to national health insurance, which, he's doing this while saying, but I'm not like a new left guy, because, at this point, the New Deal, Great Society liberalism is still more of a thing, and the new left, in some ways, was kind of at odds with it. Early on in the campaign, charisma is a big issue. There's a comedian, Mark Russell, who says if Henry Jackson gave a fireside chat, the fire would go out.
This is an incredible joke. For people who live through FDR, this is such a banger.
Yeah. His friend Jerry Hoke says that Jackson is just never going to be a good speechmaker because you cannot change a Norwegian.
I like how there was still racism against random white ethnicities back then.
Yeah.
Archie Bunker would have said the same thing.
Yeah. That is a stereotype, though, that my dad's friends will say, oh, you stubborn Norwegian.
I didn't realize my wife was Norwegian.
But in both of his campaigns for president, Jackson tended to view the Democratic primaries through the lens of his experience in Washington State, according to one of his biographies. And this is not a good analogy because in Washington, I don't know if this is still the case, but they had crossover voting. So to get the primary nomination, he had the support of independents and Republicans, and that's not really a factor in the nationwide primaries.
Sorry, random tidbit. They still have this, and our former guest Edinger Mentum used that to forecast that Kamala was going to win, and it didn't end up working out. But yeah, they still have this crossover primary
In Washington State?
Yeah, in Washington State. Yeah. No, this still exists, and yeah, it used to be predictive of the presidential election because they would do a crossover thing earlier in the year, and it was up until Kamala. I mean, maybe for whatever So it was predicted till it wasn't, but yeah, this still exists.
He got in 1958, he got an anti-war primary challenge from the left. Alice Franklin Bryant ran against him. And of course, I respect that, but it just sucks. It's you're running an anti-war candidate in the state where our entire industry is the war machine. So she got crushed, unfortunately.
Damn. Well, yeah, this is, the height of the Vietnam War. New Hampshire is where Eugene McCarthy, I don't know if you're related to him.
No, only the evil ones.
Wait, you are actually related to Joe? Okay, Tim.
No.
It is funny. They had, 50s had a evil McCarthy, 60s had kind of a good one. But he came close to beating Johnson in 1968. And so New Hampshire is seen as kind of, willing to buck the establishment and be anti-war. It is won by Muskie, but McGovern does a lot better than people expect, and the war is an issue there. And that's a state that Scoop says, there's no chance. So I'm just going to basically sit this out and wait for Florida, where there are a lot of Jews and Zionists, and there's also aerospace is very big in Florida. So perfect spot for me.
Oh, and he's like, yeah, I'm against busing, so they'll think I'm racist enough. And then George Wallace is like, no, I am the king of racism. And
Yep.
he's going to be hard to beat.
Yes. And so Scoop finishes third with 13% in Florida, a sign of not great things to come. There's a theme in his campaigns. He whines a lot about the media portraying him unfairly. There's a photo that the AP and UPI syndicate nationally where he's in the photo, he's talking to an old lady and a boy with a bicycle. And there's all these people behind him that the image doesn't capture. And he's furious that there's 200 people there if you look at it at a different angle. But it's like, Scoop, no one thought that way until you brought this up.
Oh, it's the Streisand effect, where you complain about something that makes it more famous. Is 200 people at a rally a lot for back then?
That's a good question. I mean, for a Scoop Jackson rally, I would think a lot.
The Riz-less guy who wants to bomb Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
200 people who want to nuke Vietnam.
But yeah, busing continues to be an issue. He is hit on it by McGovern, who's like, this guy's anti-busing. And then Scoop gets really offended and points out that McGovern's daughter goes to a private school in Maryland. So who is he to criticize me?
The thing with the busing was, like, I think it was designed to be unpopular. Like, I don't think it was the best way to integrate the schools. You have to kind of integrate the neighborhoods, which are racially segregated. And Scoop is basically like, he wants people to go to school, mixed schools, but he doesn't like the actual getting on the bus part and the lack of choice. But then he goes really over the top and he's like, you know what's going to help me win the races? Let's do a constitutional amendment against busing. And he proposes that, and I mean, it's obviously not going to go anywhere, but it just seems fake. It's kind of like when Bush proposed the anti-gay marriage constitutional amendment in 2004. Like, it seems like a stunt. And also, you just can't out-racist George Wallace. He doesn't just talk racism, he's lived it.
That's a tough one, because it's like, at the time, this is definitely a dog whistle for a lot of other stuff, and to be anti-busing is to like align yourself with that. But at the same time, like, the issue is, how about instead of sending kids to different schools all across town, you take the money from the rich schools and give it to the poor schools so they have better schools? But at the time, this is like obviously a very racially charged issue. This is a funny moment, is the press criticizes Jackson for his refusal to, he doesn't want to reveal the identity of his donors. And he's asked why, and he says, well, it would be very embarrassing for several high-level officials of the Nixon administration they're supporting me in secret. Which I don't know if that's he thinks that this is a good line because it'll show that Nixon is being undermined by his staff and that he's the real leader. But I think a lot of Democratic voters hear that and they're like, oh, so you're a Republican.
He doesn't want to reveal the identity of his donors, but it rhymes with rowing.
And Hess. He gets a lot of money from Hess, Amerada Hess Oil Company. They give 20% of the total funds he receives, he gets from Hess. And he says he had no knowledge of this because they disguise it under pseudonymous donors. It's not an illegal gift, but it does kind of put a bad sheen on his campaign. And he ends up being really hostile towards the oil industry during the energy crisis later on in the 70s.
Yeah, the Hess guy actually did something great for Washington State because he fires Pete Carroll in his first coach. He's the Jets owner. He fires Pete Carroll in his first coaching appearance, hires one of the worst coaches ever. The Jets are terrible, and then Pete Carroll ends up winning a Super Bowl for Washington State.
A fellow Seattleite 9/11 truther.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Now in Las Vegas, yeah. He doesn't seem like a good fit in Las Vegas, but we'll see.
Luckily, you can't bet on if 9/11 was real there. Yeah. Sure.
So
was it the coach who gave the speech to his players about be like Al Qaeda?
Yeah, another Sean, what's his name in Buffalo? Whoever the Bills coach is.
You're losing me, but I love this coach. Yeah, the Jets should hire him.
The Buffalo coach. But then Pete Carroll gave that speech, but he was like, "Boys, you need to be like the CIA.
Yeah."
You need to set up do like 4 military exercises to get all the planes on the other side of the East Coast, and then fly some drones into the towers and control demolition.
The team keeps fumbling. He's like, you're doing a controlled demolition on our Super Bowl chances.
He apparently, I remember reading this like 10 years ago when Seahawks were in the Super Bowl. He grilled a military guy who was like doing a team visit for some reason. And he was like, tell me everything you know about 9/11.
That's right. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, Boeing continues to be an issue in the campaign. The New York Times insinuates that Boeing has had a large-scale campaign to help Scoop, and Scoop really whines about this. He's mad that they're going after him because, as it turns out, there is a Boeing campaign to spend money on ads for Scoop Jackson, but it's one person, one really enthusiastic Boeing employee who is spending their own money to run ads in Wisconsin and in like a random small town, just because they're a nerd, I guess, or they see what he's doing for their company and they're grateful.
I mean, he's a lot more hawkish than George McGovern. So yeah, if you work for Boeing, you want Scoop,
right? Yeah. There is another fun scandal. There's a Nixon goon from CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, who writes a smear statement on musky campaign letterhead that says Scoop Jackson is gay and has an illegitimate daughter, I guess via artificial insemination.
That's crazy. I don't even know if they had that back then. But it's very Michael Jackson. Yeah. Billie Jean. Yeah. It's that situation.
Yeah. There's a story from his biography that kind of sums up a problem, all the problems with his campaign. It's illustrative of basically all of them. He's scheduled to do an interview with NBC, but he insists we can't do it because tonight we're supposed to have an event at a bowling alley. And his people say to him, like, well, Scoop, like, you're going to meet like 50 people at the bowling alley. You'll be exposed to hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million people on air. And he's like, nope, we need to do this bowling alley because that's where I thrive, is at bowling alleys and union halls.
He's like, you don't get it. I got a 215 average.
Yeah. But so he goes ahead with the event. According to one of his friends, it's a great event. And there's no footage of this, but supposedly he arm wrestles a bunch of, this is in Wisconsin, so a bunch of burly, like, Wisconsinites and beats them in arm wrestling, which feels like a little bit of myth making.
That's amazing. Yeah, if they had professional arm wrestling, he would have won some states.
Yeah.
I mean, it seemed like he won his congressional seat, and when he was the Snohomish County prosecutor, he just won that through, like, retail politics, like a very local level. So it seems like he knew how to do that. He just didn't really understand national politics.
Yeah.
Or I guess, his disciples would learn how to sell warmongering insanity a little better than he did.
Right. Yeah, he's only able to win Washington State, and he does so very narrowly. There's a lot of these local people who are in favor of McGovern during that primary. And his overall total is 3.11%. He drops out in early May after a poor showing in Ohio. And then, McGovern gets the nomination, of course, loses. But Scoop's focus becomes on getting an amendment passed because Nixon is pursuing sort of not quite a detente, but at least some trade normalization with the Soviet Union. And Scoop is really dead set on allowing emigration, particularly of Jews from the Soviet Union. And this becomes a big historical phenomenon and is part of his legacy, the refuseniks.
Oh, yeah, Russia's refusing. Yes, a fellow Jew from that part of the world. My family came about 100 years before that. But, yeah, there's Jews who want to leave the Soviet Union, and Russia's not allowing them. And I think they should have been allowed to leave. But there's a lot of, like, merging of this kind of movement with Zionism and with anti-capitalist sentiment. And for me, it's like, it's not like, well, let the Jews move and have their own capitalism where they oppress people. Let's actually make the world better for everybody.
Well, actually, and speaking of Zionism, I saw on his Wikipedia in his 72 campaign, he apparently appeared with Meir Kahane in fucking New York City, and that's like an actual terrorist. This Jewish Defense League.
Oh my God!
Like his most controversial thing was he was photographed like with a woman, and the 200 people weren't in the background. It's like he's fucking having pep rallies with this murdering psycho.
And speaking of which, there's a quote from someone who worked for him about the refuseniks, who says that the political lesson of the Soviet Jewry movement is that there is simply no substitute for power and the unashamed willingness to use it. The person who said that worked for Jackson, went on to be an awful terrorist against the human race. Elliot Abrams was one of his staffers. So, yeah, as you said, he really groomed a lot of people who went on to become neocons in the Reagan administration and beyond.
Yeah, it was like his staffers include Richard Pearl was like probably the most senior one, but Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Bill Kristol, Elliot Abrams, Douglas Feith, Charles Homer. I mean, like, that's just such a crazy list. I mean, it's like the virus originated here. This is where it all came from. Everything that we've experienced since 9/11, like, it all was incubated under Scoop Jackson's Senate term.
All from the same scoop.
Yeah, that's really rough. Yeah, Elliot Abrams also, like, I know he went on. He went on Mike Huckabee's like podcast or something like right after October 7th. So yeah, there's a connection to the current administration as well.
Oh yeah.
But he runs again in 1976. He's really not a fan of the Helsinki Accords in 1975 that recognized Soviet Union's presence in Eastern Europe, but tried to get them to uphold some human rights standards. But
he basically says the human rights standards aren't enforceable. So we're giving them something. We're recognizing them in Eastern Europe, which is something Ford gets in trouble for in the debates in 76. And then we're not really getting anything. And it opens up commerce, and he doesn't want to help the Soviet Union commercially. Though the carrot of this helping the Soviet Union commercially does kind of help encourage the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 80s, according to the book, the Collapse book that I just read.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I was going to say, if we're in the 70s now, I can just talk for a minute on Peter Dale Scott is like the author who's like most influenced my current political beliefs. I really recommend everybody read his work. But he talks about Scoop Jackson for like a couple pages in his book, The Road to 9/11. And his basic thesis is that in the 1970s, in 1973, the Trilateral Commission is set up. And the Trilateral Commission was more internationalist, or at least like its idea was essentially protecting transnational investments, transnational property. So they're not as interested in like direct war or confrontation with the Soviet Union. They're more like, let's just kind of delineate our spheres and like make sure U.S. businesses are protected in, XYZ area, this kind of thing. And he posits that Scoop Jackson and his acolytes were opposed to that. And he says that Scoop Jackson was part of what was called the Coalition for a Democratic Majority Foreign Policy Task Force, which eventually merged and became the second Committee on the Present Danger. Because the original Committee on the Present Danger was 1950, and then the second one becomes public in 1976, but it was kind of like incubated before then. And Peter Dale Scott says David Packard of Hewlett-Packard provided the initial funding grant for the second Committee on the Present Danger. And he did that because Hewlett-Packard made the anti-ballistic missiles. So the SALT treaty, would have shut down anti-ballistic missiles. And Scoop Jackson, of course, was against the SALT. He was against SALT II. So there was like this financial incentive for it. And basically, as we were mentioning, Scoop Jackson's like saying that they're so underestimating the Soviet Union's strength. William Colby is the CIA director. He's fired by Gerald Ford in this big shakeup called the Halloween Massacre in November 1975. Kissinger's demoted. He loses National Security Advisor. He stays Secretary of State, and a couple other shakeups happen there. But that's kind of and Donald Rumsfeld becomes Defense Secretary, and that's kind of recognized the Halloween Massacre as like the Trilateralists losing out to the Neoconservatives, and so George H.W. Bush becomes CIA director. He orders this Team B study, which is 12 people from outside the CIA come in to critique the CIA's annual assessment of the Soviet Union's strength. And Team B is chaired by Richard Pipes, who was discovered by Richard Pearl. And Richard Pearl was, of course, like Scoop Jackson's Senate aide. And Paul Wolfowitz was also on Team B. And Richard Pearl was described as the driving force. When he was Senate aide to Scoop Jackson, he was described as the driving force behind congressional opposition to arms control with the Soviet Union. So it's it is just kind of interesting to see like that entire neoconservative spawning or counter-revolution to the brief moment of détente in the 1970s.
Damn.
That was really well said. Yeah. Also, in that shakeup, Dick Cheney becomes chief of staff.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh. Well, yeah. This is priming him for his second run for the presidency. Gives a big speech. It seems like it's bigger than the last one. He gives it before 1,100 people. There's a special 5-minute documentary that's made just for that occasion. Last time, as we said, he did it in the Senate caucus room, which is a mistake. So he corrects that by going to the Washington Press Club, where he launches the second campaign.
That feels like it's a 2-minute walk away.
Yeah.
Still not getting in a car away from the Senate.
Right. But he's the favorite. He's healthier. He's lost weight. He's gotten surgery to fix his droopy eyelid, and he does have to get hospitalized twice since he's a back problem. But other than that, he seems to be healthier, but still has no riz. He can't answer questions in a very convincing way that's relatable. His speeches are very dry, and as someone says, all the media advice in the world could not make Henry Jackson telegenic as a presidential candidate. He had to work from a tight script rather than respond informally to probing questions, and that comes through on the Sunday morning news programs where people take note if you're boring and you're not off the cuff and you're just bland. He is, even though people think, now he'll be the favorite, he's just not connecting.
He also has an even worse logo. this time. Like the other logo was bad. Look at this. It's all basically an all white logo.
Yeah.
Still with the Jackson. He's like, make the J bigger and get rid of the colors.
It's no good. Yeah. He's kind of relying on union support, but unions are sort of splintering. People have moved to the suburbs, and the Democratic Party is becoming more about yuppies and multiculturalism, and Jackson is not ready for that. And the unions are going out for Humphrey, who is not running, but they think he's going to come in, and so they're just waiting for him to bow in, and Jackson is trying to court them, but they're not really biting.
Yeah, they're treating him like a bridesmaid. And the sad thing, no one really knows at the time, but like Humphrey's body is breaking down, and he'll be dead by 1978. But he actually could have probably won this election, and probably would have been a lot better than Jimmy Carter if he was healthy.
That's sad. And nobody could put him back together again.
Yeah.
Oh, not at all.
Not all three. You got 2 H's maybe, but the third, you're out of luck.
No, it's a king's horses and king's men situation, right? Yeah.
The primaries, he skips Iowa, New Hampshire. Iowa, the Iowa caucus becomes a big deal this year because Jimmy Carter wins it out of nowhere. And then New Hampshire ends up being a mistake because that's where he could have potentially stopped Jimmy Carter in his tracks.
Yeah, he could have stopped the Carter momentum. Also, like, he's going hard in Massachusetts, and that's a neighboring state. So you might as well campaign in New Hampshire. But he skips it, and it really doesn't help because Carter ends up winning that and just having a lot of momentum.
Yeah, and he's got a lot of support in the South, name recognition, and Scoop has an uphill battle there.
Do you know who this Udall guy is? There's a mention of a guy named Udall.
Mo Udall?
Okay, yeah, I knew you would know him. Yeah, the idea is even like he could have helped Udall win New Hampshire. Where's Udall from?
Utah, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, okay. Well, somehow Udall had a chance in New Hampshire, and that would at least stop Carter's momentum, even if Jackson couldn't have won it.
Yeah. He claims that Carter's going to cut defense and get rid of the mortgage interest deduction. And eventually Carter does kind of cut some defense, and Jackson's really mad about it.
Yeah, Carter did cut defense, and that's not good because then Reagan can run on increasing it again.
Right.
But Jackson really fumbles the expectations game. So when he wins, he's not supposed to, it doesn't seem like a comeback because he's just the media downplays it, and he's again not very good at working the press. He wins Massachusetts, right?
Oh yeah, Massachusetts is the peak of his campaign.
Yeah,
he does win. It helps that he had attacked Jimmy Carter for being basically trying to be all things to all people. Like he'd make a lot of inconsistent promises.
Yeah. And he gets kind of desperate and wants to win Florida, despite that it's not going to a guy from Washington State. It's going to go to Wallace or Jimmy Carter. And it falls short, wastes some resources. And then he somehow has a big win in New York.
See, he screws it up. He wins big in New York, but he's so excited when he wins Massachusetts. He's like, we're going to have a blowout win in New York. And, like, I don't even know what defines that, but he wins pretty big, and it's just not enough. And the media's like, well, of course he won New York, and they just start talking about how he doesn't win Wisconsin, which is the same day.
God, this guy is just a loser. He's even when he wins, he can't make it seem like a win.
He's a smoke-filled rooms kind of guy. Yeah, like that's how Truman got appointed. He's that kind of guy. Yeah, TV's no good for him.
And Jimmy Carter, obviously very telegenic, media savvy. He gets a lot more credit for winning Wisconsin by a little bit than Jackson does for winning New York by a lot. The rest of his campaign, he's fairly low on funds, but he refuses to borrow any money because he's a depression kid, and he doesn't trust moneylenders and banks, etc.
Yeah, so this is 1976. He's driving a car from 1961 that Walter Mondale, who eventually becomes Carter's running mate, says this is something that ought to have been condemned.
So his last stand is in Pennsylvania. He's out of money, not a lot of momentum, and it seems like this would be a place to bow out, but he publicly says, we're going to press on, we're going to persevere, and then eventually does drop out, even though he maybe could have taken it to the convention.
Yeah, there's a chance he keeps going. He could get it to a contested convention. The big thing is he is like, I do not want to be VP. Okay, he does not like Jimmy Carter. He calls him the quote says, "I would not run with the blankety blank under any circumstances." So we don't know. The records don't tell us what curse words he used, but he does have curse words to say about Jimmy Carter.
Closest to Scandinavian gets to cursing.
Yeah. That's actually probably a curse word in Norwegian. Blankety blank. But yeah, Mondale becomes the VP, of course, who is Norwegian. So I probably that was the lane Carter was looking for. So if he couldn't have Scoop, he'll take Fritz.
And he's a New Deal guy. Mondale. He has similar domestic policies, and he's not a crazy war whore. So that's nice.
Yeah. But then, yeah, after his last vanquishment, he predicts that in 1980 Ted Kennedy is going to win the nomination, and that's not true. But he really hates Jimmy Carter.
And Carter roasted for it. Carter's like 3 or 4 years ago when I was running for president. At that time, he predicted he would be the next president. So his judgment was not very good.
Yeah. But he does almost go into the Reagan administration.
Yeah, he's ready. I mean, at this point, he's not going to run for president again. And it's 1980. Reagan's won, and he's trying to maybe get into the cabinet. But the thing is, he didn't support Reagan in the election, so it's a little bit too late. And Reagan picks. I'm trying to remember the name of the guy, but he picks somebody else who has a pretty similar policy.
But it's only a couple years into Reagan, which it seems like he likes better than Carter, to be honest, in a lot of ways. Maybe not on domestic stuff. But
I would think so. And Reagan likes him. Yeah, him.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think he likes Reagan's domestic policy. And what person would?
Yeah. But he dies after he wins re-election in 1982. He has a heart attack in 1983, and he dies in the United States Senate.
The dream of every senator. We did a Henry Clay episode about a year ago, and Henry Clay came back to the Senate to die.
Wow.
So the goal of the Senate is either become president or die in the Senate.
Yeah, when John McCain was dying, they let him start one last war.
But yeah, his legacy, we've been talking about, he's not like well known to the extent that another presidential loser might be, but very much impactful on American politics and on American foreign policy. There's a eulogy given by Ronald Reagan where he says that Nancy and I are deeply affected and saddened to learn of the death of Henry Jackson. He was a friend, a colleague, a true patriot. He will be sorely missed. And there's a story where it's about the TV address after the Korean airline massacre. Reagan goes out of his way to praise Scoop Jackson as a wise and revered statesman who probably knew the Soviets as well as any in American history. Scoop, maybe instead of like trying to figure out what's going on in the Soviet Union, every iota of it, you should focus on how to get elected in the America where you live and like hire some campaign staff or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, it's weird. Yeah, because like like I said, he only went there once. So like knowledge of the Soviets about knowing them as an enemy, not actually going there and meeting people and building relationships.
It's interesting. I mean, the kind of weaponized Keynesianism, it is kind of like the organized labor working with the mafia, where it just kind of eventually is going to destroy the original project. Where it's like a guy like Scoop Jackson, as I said, I do believe that he earnestly believed in this kind of New Deal stuff, but he was so committed to the weaponized Keynesianism that it eventually consumes the other half of it. So, and that's like what Ronald Reagan epitomized in just every administration since, really, is we're jettisoning the New Deal, but we're going to keep the neoconservatism, and in fact, we're going to turn the dial up on it like every 4 years. I mean, it's just I don't know. I lived through the George W. Bush administration. I was quite young, and I remember how psychotic this country was after 9/11. But even today, I think it is worse because like just what is being done in Gaza and just the lack of like public comment or just the shutting down of all dissent with regards to it. Like they are, what they're doing now to these students, this is more brutal than they treated the opposition to the Iraq war. I mean, it's, we're just seeing we're seeing the long-term impact of weaponized Keynesianism and the cultural ideas that go behind it.
Yeah. Yeah, and if even as bad as the Democrats have been, I think this shows how bloodthirsty and crazed Scoop Jackson was, is that during 2023, 2024, Biden meets with Netanyahu and tells him, well, help me out here. At least, drop a few less bombs, try to kill a few less kids, because Biden's words, this isn't Scoop Jackson's Democratic Party anymore, because he's starting to face some opposition, because for the first time, mass amounts of Americans are against the degradation of the Palestinian people, which means that Scoop Jackson's legacy is fading. But unfortunately, it still has a real foothold in the minds of policymakers.
Yeah, it's just crazy that these weapons are being dropped on people in tents. They're designed maybe for the Cold War to fight some communist menace, and now it's okay, we're dropping them on people living in tents in Gaza.
It is funny that that just kind of shows you how Biden's mind works, where it wasn't Scoop Jackson's Democratic Party since 1968. Yeah. Once people, they had some leeway with Vietnam, but once by 68, the Democratic Party did not, or the average Democratic Party voter did not go for this bullshit anymore. But,
yeah.
You just kind of terrorize people with 9/11 or whatever, and that'll buy you a little leeway.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, do you think there's anything Scoop Jackson knew that, because he was, interestingly, you were saying kind of to the right of the CIA on some stuff, but do you think he was in on any secrets? Because there's that weird stuff with Richard Pearl and...
Yeah. It's, I'm sure just he would know the scuttlebutt, the October surprise where they did Jimmy Carter dirty, dealt with the Iranians. That was an open secret even at the time.
Yeah.
It only just recently became officially confirmed and is not treated like a conspiracy theory anymore. But I was going to say it's kind of it's a tragedy that he didn't live long enough to see his disciples and Senate aides carry out 9/11.
I did want to say a couple things he predicted correctly. Yeah, he does in 72. He's saying how Iran is not going to hold and be the stabilization in the region, the Shah's government. So he is predicting that. And then with the Soviets, he was right in that they're going to have economic issues and they're going to have to either liberalize or collapse. And then Gorbachev basically ends up doing both at the same time poorly. But he is seeing that, seeing the trouble coming in the Soviet Union as early as the 70s.
Interesting. Well, we like to round out by trying to figure out or picture what would have happened if somehow Scoop Jackson made it to the White House. 76, I think, may have been a possibility if he had let go of some of his Norwegian stubbornness and taken some cues from better national politicians on how to relate to people, how to do interviews, been more media savvy, gone to New Hampshire after Iowa. Maybe he beats Jimmy Carter and he's in the White House. Seems like he is dead set on some kind of confrontation with the Soviet Union. Could have been a hot war, maybe in some third place. I don't know. At that point, Vietnam is over. I'm sure he would have found some new frontier to have some showdown over. Panama Canal probably would not have gone back to the Panamanians, and we would have... he probably wouldn't have done neoliberalism as quickly. Maybe he would have succumbed to certain pressures, but there weren't, a lot of that was ideological on Carter's part. So maybe he would have passed a stronger Humphrey Hawkins bill, and unions we would have had a strong labor aristocracy theory coming to fruition in the United States potentially.
That is funny to think about. Yeah. Actually, though, here's my impression of Scoop Jackson in the White House. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, maybe we'd all be dead.
Yeah, but no, you're right. Maybe we wouldn't. Maybe the Jimmy Carter deregulating trucking and airlines and all that bullshit that we're all suffering through still, maybe he would have resisted on that.
So the Jimmy Carter peace deal doesn't happen in this scenario. So I think he establishes a greater Israel. Israel creates a big empire in the Middle East, possibly defeats the Soviet Union, but we do get universal health care. So a little...
Wow.
Yeah, so greater Israel exists, but then they have universal health care, but also we do.
We're like 200 times as evil, but we have Medicare for all.
Yeah. All right. Well, Scoop Jackson, you've been vanquished. Sean P. McCarthy, where can people find you and your stuff?
SeanPMcCarthy.substack.com, Sean McCarthy.com on Twitter X, and also I have a new podcast with Angela Nagel called Rocinante. Patreon.com/Rocinantepod, ROCINANTEPOD.
All right. That's vanquished.